Welcome to the AIEA series on international education and how it has been shaped and changed by leaders who are beginning to approach the age of retirement, which means leaders who have really brought international education into the forefront of American higher education, both a forefront that is fraught with challenges as well as support. And one challenge long in our field that is changing today has been the challenge of having a theoretical foundation and a foundation of knowledge about the field upon which to move forward. Our guest today is Madeleine Green, who has made a unique contribution to our field in really developing a foundation of research and a foundation of knowledge and understanding that brings us to where we are today. So it is a pleasure for me to welcome Madeleine Green to this series. Madeleine, I would really love to start by asking you about the beginning. What were you doing? How did you get an international education? As I've mentioned with others with whom I've spoken, people of our generation are people who most often accidentally fell into this because it didn't exist, and so we had to create it as we went. Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about your own background and what you were doing and how you prepared, if you prepared for this specifically, or if it found you, etc.
Well, as you say, like many women of our generation, my career was accidental. I started my graduate career thinking I would be a professor of French literature. And so I got a PhD in French. I taught for a few years, and very early on in my career, the job market collapsed. This was the mid-70s.
Right.
So the collapse of the market for teaching positions in foreign languages and English began a long time ago. So I began to think about, well, what else could I do? I hadn't even contemplated what would life look like as a career as an adjunct, as many young PhDs do today. So I began to think, well, what else could I do? So I accidentally fell into a job at the American Council on Education, mm-hmm. in a position for which I had no particular experience other than having known something about higher education from teaching. It was a wonderful break. I will be forever grateful to the man who took a big leap and hired me. And I spent many years at ACE, well, the first 4 years working in non-traditional education in a project that was funded by FIPSI to award credit for extra institutional learning. It was a very revolutionary concept at the time.
When was this?
1974 to 78. Right. And in 1978 I became director of the ACE Fellows Program, which was a wonderful, amazing opportunity to learn about higher education, to learn about leadership, about organizational change. So I took my on-the-ground experience and I turned that into an intellectual interest, wrote about leadership.
And that was before leadership became the disciplinary star it is today.
It was just emerging, and there was a body of scholarship, nothing like what exists today. A lot of what was written in higher education were, here's how I did it, the college president's point of view. There certainly were theoretical works, but there wasn't a whole lot at the nexus. And I did that until 1990. Mm-hmm. 1990-91, I took a leave of absence to be the interim president of Mount Vernon College. Mm-hmm. And that was quite an adventure. It was a very difficult year. Mount Vernon was in trouble, more trouble than I knew, than the trustees knew. And now it is a part of George Washington University.
Right.
It didn't survive as an independent institution. But at the end of, before I went to Mount Vernon, in 1987, I learned about a leadership development program for new college presidents, rectors and vice chancellors, offered by what was then called the Conference of European Rectors. And I thought, oh, how interesting. I'm doing this for American presidents. And part of my portfolio was workshops for new college presidents, which ACE was doing in the 80s and is now back to doing. And
I used to do some consulting for that group in international education. It was fun.
For which
I think it was ACE, but I'll check it, yeah.
And so this was 1987, and I was planning a trip to Europe, so I asked the then president of ACE if I could go to that as an observer, and I contacted the Conference of European Rectors. And it was a fascinating experience because it was leadership in a comparative context. It opened a whole world to me about European higher education. I had been completely immersed in US higher education. So I wrote a very long memo when I got back about the work of the Conference of European Rectors and all that was going on. And Bob Atwell, the then president of ACE, said, well, you should be doing something in international. And we'll just add that to your portfolio.
That's a typical way we all began too. Yes.
Barbara Turlington was at ACE at the time,
yeah.
working in international, a lot on domestic policy. So I sort of joined the team. And in 1991, when I came back from Mount Vernon, I moved out of the directorship of the Fellows Program into international with some continuing responsibilities for leadership development. So,
well, your career has been very interesting because it has not been a career, except for your year at Mount Vernon, that's been based within an institution, although I'm sure that was a really eye-opening experience. But it's been a career with the associations, and they are very often not talked about that much when we talk about contributions, and yet the associations with whom I have worked, and I think it was ASCE's presidents that I worked with, not rather than ACE, but these associations have made huge contributions to our field, I think, and that's where I think it's really important to explore what you did at ACE and what you've done since. I know you continue, even after your departure from ACE, to be at the Institute of
the International Association
of University Presidents. Yes, I'm sorry, of universities, IAEA. This is my third interview, and I've lost control of the alphabet. I apologize. And you are a senior fellow now at NAFSA.
That's correct.
And IAEA. Yes. So you're still very involved in the association side of contributing to our field. When you started with ACE and International after your time at Mount Vernon, what was the landscape there for International? What was happening and what was not happening that needed to happen?
Well, ACE had always been involved in advocacy. It had been involved to a certain extent in development work with the Overseas Liaison Committee that I think faded out sometime in the 1980s. Rose Hayden led that effort. So ACE had been visible, but like many institutions, it didn't have a strategy. It did advocacy as necessary. The development work was externally funded by USAID, but the whole question of what happens on US campuses was not yet on ACE's screen.
Not always on the campuses
Right,
screen.
and it wasn't, so it was a different era, so it makes sense that it was
Right.
not. So when I began in the early 90s, we began to think about more what's going on campuses, how can the associations be a catalyst for greater movement, more information, more awareness of internationalization. That's been a very long, slow process on campuses.
Yes.
And I think one of the things we did in the 90s, we had a very big project with South Africa, continuing our engagement with overseas institutions, working with about 20 institutions on their transformation, moving out of the apartheid system. But at the same time, we were thinking about US campuses and began a series of projects that engaged campuses. We had competitions, they were selected, they worked on various internationalization projects, and it was a way of having a much greater visibility for campus internationalization through our work. And the first project was, I guess, in the early 2000s, called Promising Practices, where we began spotlighting campuses and looking at the process of internationalization. And here's where my work on organizational culture and change came in, and was very important. In the 90s, I worked on a 5-year project funded by the Kellogg Foundation on institutional transformation. And that, in a way, was a very important grounding, because internationalization is a form of transformation.
Yes, it is.
It is not a superficial change, so we began to think deeply about what is change and how does it occur, what are the obstacles, and that just morphed right into our internationalization work.
So what was the mission of ACE's internationalization work? What goals did you have in mind as you developed all of these services and programs?
Well, they were multiple. I think one was to add to the information base. We began doing what's continued today, the mapping study.
Yes.
What's going on campuses. So that was a way of holding up a mirror to American higher education and say, let's look at what's going on. And that started in the 1990s,
right.
And we did a series of publications. We then looked at the data, what is happening in community colleges and research universities, so that we could have very specific portraits. We wanted to highlight good practice, provide a forum for internationalization leaders, not in competition with AIEA or NAFSA, but a forum where they could come to our collaborative, which we started also in the early 2000s, with faculty members, and bridge that divide between international ed folks and faculty. We were particularly interested in engaging senior leaders. So, and it still exists today. We started it, I think, in the 90s. The Internationalization Leadership Network, where we invited presidents and provosts, and they could bring their SIO, but they couldn't send their SIO.
Oh, yes, that's interesting.
So that was an annual meeting to engage leaders in thinking about internationalization. ACE is a presidential organization.
Right.
So they had to be an important target of...
It's a way of educating the president. If it was these meetings were held with the SIO. Although, were there SIOs? I mean, that in itself.
There was always somebody
on a campus who was committed. Yeah.
And certainly the number of SIOs have grown, but by the early 2000s, you were seeing a fair number of them.
So in the 90s, a lot more universities than ever had before began to include in their mission statements missions about internationalization. So there was beginning to be a rise in the acceptance of the centrality and importance of the idea, but it was still very new. And what were the challenges you faced in trying to have presidents understand the value of this to their own work? You take a deep breath and sigh.
Good question, yes. One of the classic presentations I did based on the data we gathered was about the gap between the rhetoric and the reality. The practices just didn't match the mission statements. And I mean, I think in the past 25 years, the gap has narrowed. And in important and very positive ways. But we still have the legacy of a very partial view of internationalization. Internationalization for some institutions is about study abroad. Internationalization for too many presidents is about international students and revenue. So I think the beat goes on to continue to broaden the definition, to keep beating the drum of comprehensive internationalization, to remind people that a tiny fraction of our students study abroad, and even when they do, there may be 2 weeks of a faculty-led program, and that does not a global citizen make. So I think we're still, as a profession, working on the broadening of the definition and the deepening of the roots, although a lot has happened.
A lot has happened, and am I misremembering the name Sheila Biddle? Did she do a book called something about rhetoric and reality?
Yes, she did.
That was excellent about this point. And you're right, I believe that the rhetoric and the reality have merged somewhat, but not entirely, without question. And sometimes the rhetoric exaggerates. In study abroad, for example, it remains 3% of the American population, undergraduate population, who study abroad. It's not 10% or 15%, or it's a very small number. So internationalization on our domestic campuses, where the vast number of students will spend their entire undergraduate careers, is as important as it is in terms of internationally sending students out. What kind of research and work do you think has been instrumental in the work that you've done in helping move these agendas forward, helping people understand these issues? I know the mapping series very well, and I found it both helpful in my own research, but helpful as a way of talking to institutions.
Yes. Anything you can count takes on more importance.
Belief, right?
And I think holding up a mirror to current practice is a useful way of reminding people by using the facts, which is a loaded term today, to remind them of the existing gap between rhetoric and reality. So I think that's been important. I think there's been an important shift in the conversation, and I'm not quite sure how we trace this, to talking about internationalization not as a goal unto itself, but as a way of furthering the missions of teaching, research, and service. And I think speaking the language of institutions, for research universities, internationalization of research is just, that's
Central.
front and center,
Right.
front and center.
Especially giving ratings,
And
world rankings.
So I think that shift in the conversation, and that's something that associations can help do. They shape conversations. So I think that's been a helpful movement in higher education.
So, in your own research and your own publications, are there projects that stand out for you that you cared about deeply and you felt were really helpful?
Well, I think the cumulative effect of some of what I would call what I did action research. I mean, it wasn't, some of it was grounded in a theoretical basis, but a lot of it was based on what we saw at the institutions, looking across them and saying, and I think that kind of applied knowledge is very useful in higher education.
It is.
Leaders don't read higher education journals. The kinds of things that AIEA members read are not what leaders read.
Right.
So I think, and stories are very powerful. So I think associations and projects like that become a repository of stories of success, stories of where institutions stumbled, and those sort of enter the discourse, and then you can highlight them in various meetings. I think another thing that happened at ACE in particular was trying to make our annual meeting more international itself. And walking the talk as an association, saying this is a meeting like AIEA and like NAFSA that invites in our presidential colleagues from other countries. We are interested in that dialogue. So I think that too has an impact on how you move things along.
And I can add, just because of my own personal research and publications, that the work that you have done in its action provided the foundation for theory to be able to be developed. Because they have to be connected to be useful and worthwhile. And so I think it has contributed in many ways across the board, and you continue to do that in the years since you left ACE by working with IAU and being a senior fellow in NAFSA, etc. What are you doing with these organizations? How is it different from what you've done in the past, and what are the challenges you're seeing as you work in the current environment?
Excuse me. Well, one of the things I've done with IAU, which has been fascinating, is work with them on a program called the Internationalization Strategy Advisory Service, which is in some way a cousin of ACE's International Lab, Internationalization Lab, which I started 15 years ago. It's now in its 15th group. Because it's on a global scale, they can't have a cohort. But what IAU does is work with institutions around the world in helping them develop or refine their internationalization strategy. And so that has provided a window for me in looking at internationalization in different national and cultural contexts. So we have our own sense of what does internationalization mean in the United States. It doesn't always mean the same thing in other countries. And they have histories, they have political, procedural, cultural contexts that really shape internationalization quite differently.
Right.
So that's been fascinating to see what does it look like in Japan, what does it look like in Botswana or Lithuania.
Right.
And it looks quite different.
So can you give me a couple of examples of what these differences are?
Well, in many countries, there's a national policy on internationalization.
Right.
And with a pretty powerful ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So we did a second review of the University of Hokkaido in Japan. The first one was in 2010, was a very general review of their strategy. The second review was a more specialized one looking at their monitoring and assessment of internationalization. But all of this was in the context of a 10-year grant from their ministry to do very specific things and that align with the goals of the ministry. International students is very high on the ministry's list. Almost every ministry that meddles around in internationalization is obsessed with rankings.
Mm-hmm.
So these drive institutional behaviors in ways that we don't see in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Internationalization is very much one institution at a time.
Yeah.
And of course, national policy affects us directly in terms of security, visas, but the Department of Education isn't issuing any edicts on how to internationalize. And that creates a totally different dynamic in an institution. It's one institution at a time, one faculty member at a time.
At a time.
That's
Makes it must be more challenging in decentralized structures, but at the same time, I suppose there's room for creativity that might not exist in other structures. I'm not sure.
Well, you're right. I think it cuts both ways.
Yeah.
And you have the herding cats phenomenon.
Right.
Without lots of buy-in, nothing much happens.
Mm-hmm.
I have been on campuses where, the president proclaimed in the U.S. this is the identity and the mission of the institution. They hung flags all over, and the faculty were sitting around saying, "Where are we?" So you can do that
Right.
in Japan to a certain extent, but faculty are to a large extent autonomous in many ways in many institutions. So to reach in and say, here's how you're going to internationalize your course, you could say, we're going to teach a certain number of courses in English.
Right.
That's one thing. But to rethink your particular course, that's a different kettle of fish. So when you have these sort of policies and pronouncements, you tend to get a much more superficial form of internationalization.
That's very interesting.
But an exception to that is there's been a big push for joint and double degrees, mostly joint degrees in Europe. Lots of funding for that. And that really engages faculty from the bottom up. But if you don't have a mechanism for real bottom-up buy-in and willingness to change what you teach, how you teach it, you're going to have a much more superficial kind of change.
So the work that you're doing now with organizations like NAFSA, are you beginning to look at these kinds of issues and try to think about the future and what the challenges are that we'll be facing?
Well, the NAFSA Senior Fellows is a small group of us that think about the future, do some writing about the future, try to help NAFSA think about sort of the big issues. A lot of NAFSA's membership is kind of doing their jobs on the ground. So It's a wonderful luxury for the senior fellows. We just get to sit around and think about the big issues and
Well, it's
put them
also
on
a
the table.
benefit.
Put
to
them on the
field.
table for NAFSA,
Yeah.
but.
What are some of the big issues?
Well, I think the drive for accountability and impact, which is shaping all of higher education.
Yes, yes.
And of course, it's very meaningful for internationalization. What's the benefit? Why are you doing this? So I think sort of putting internationalization in the context of all the pressures on higher education, the drive for revenue. Is international going to wind up being a business?
And is there lost revenue as well as gained revenue in the process?
Say more about what you mean.
Well, outbound students taking tuition dollars away from campuses, for example.
Yeah, many institutions have figured out how to keep the tuition dollars of their study abroad students, and that's another issue. So I think, and of course, the senior fellows have not had a discussion since the election, and I think
maybe we could videotape that discussion.
I think we are now in just a very different period. And if we thought that we were being called to task for what are the benefits of this, we're now operating in a much more negative environment.
Right.
The senior fellows collaborated on a piece that's on the NAFSA website on reactions to Brexit.
Mm-hmm.
And this was again before the election. And my few paragraphs were about international education has always existed in an environment that ranges from skeptical to hostile. So Brexit is nothing nothing new. It's
Mm-hmm.
just intensifying and codifying what's always been a certain amount of noise in the background.
Right.
And of course, were I to write those paragraphs today, I would say the same thing about the environment we live in.
Right.
The floodgates have opened for those who would say, America first. Why do we need immigrants? Why do we need trade? Why do we need globalization?
And in some cases,
So-
education. Why do we need
Yeah.
education for some?
So this is not new. It's just from background noise to a deafening roar.
Yeah. Well, we are entering an era of a deafening roar. At least that seems to be what it is at the moment, and it's around us. So it's very important that people like you are taking the time to think about these issues, and in your case, taking the time to write about them and continuing to contribute to the field. So I thank you very much for taking the time to do this interview.
It's a great conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks
It
for
was a
having
pleasure.
me.
Well, I will just end by saying that a great deal of my research involved Madeleine as my citation in every third footnote. So I was always grateful for her
You
work.
made my week. Thank you.